The Witch, Season of Storms, Year 1. Around them, the rain had begun to fall torrentially, and where it stopped, the soil wept. Rivulets of cold, sharp water that tore through her skin like liquid bullets drenched Lorelei, and that was without factoring in the river ahead of them. Coppery orange water topped with russet foam gushed around sharp rocks that were as much teeth as they were boulders. And though land was visible in the distance, it was all but bisected, truly earning the river its name.
The maw.
Lorelei whispered, not stopping to brush strands of her hair out of her face as it fell around her cheeks in tangled clumps. Though Mildred had at times stopped to conjure tasteless food or weak beverages, none of them had been very filling, and Mildred had grown more and more disappointed whenever she, or Dennis, asked for them. And recently, the witch had said nothing, simply glaring in the direction of her apprentice when Lorelei had asked for the gift of sustenance.
If you cannot deign to find your own food, kindling, can you really claim strength enough to cross the waters?
And that night, Mildred had disappeared. Dennis had been terrified, of course, screaming and flailing around as he yelled curses and pleaded for her to come back intermittently. But Lorelei had a hunch that the witch was not so far gone, and though she desperately wished for something that'd block the rain, she wasn't going to show her concern openly. Not when they were so close. Besides, the weather had been like this for weeks, and only getting stronger. Though the mud-like ground had been hard for her to wheel through at first, eventually the rain and dirt had begun to congeal into something that almost felt like solid tarmac. She wasn't sure how she felt about that, but at least it had been easy to navigate. Dennis wheezed from behind her, half out of exhaustion and half out of anxiety. He had that look on his face that suggested he wanted to say something, but wasn't going to say it until she asked several times. So Lorelei decided it probably wasn't important.
I want to go home,
Dennis mumbled, cleaning his sunglasses for the umpteenth time, only for the rain to obscure them once again.
What?
Unsure which shocked her more, his venturing a question without any real drama, or the sudden bout of homesickness, Lorelei wheeled around to get a good look at the Dark Lord. He was soaking wet, and looking all the worse for wear. His clothes clung to him unflatteringly, and though she had taken time to cut her own hair, amateurishly and poorly, admittedly, he had just let it grow and hang around him to his shoulders. His frown was more miserable than angry, and he no longer smelled of salt and cheese, just salt.
I said, I wanna go home. This place sucks suckage. I didn't know things were gonna be so bad here. I could be watching television, or maybe schooling some scrubs.
Dennis paused to stare skyward, and yelled at the rain clouds above. They didn't yell back.
Well, maybe you can go home, after we cross the maw. Is there some kind of portal or something that leads directly to your realm? Is it under the island, or what? Parallel, kind of. Like, you wouldn't understand because you're a girl, but imagine potato chips, okay? Each chip comes from the same potato. That's how it works.
Content with his explanation and his previous whining having been fed with some schadenfreude, Dennis smirked and shut up, clearly feeling much better. Lorelei resisted the urge to snap back at him with a restraint that surprised even herself. Maybe it was just the maw, reflecting their faces distortedly in the waters that composed it. Knowing that they'd have to cross it eventually was a challenge, something she could focus on, and she was beginning to have an idea of how she could not just surpass it, but thrive.
Do you have boats in the demon realm, Dennis? How what? Can you chop some trees down, for me? I promise I'll find us something to eat soon, if you can do that.
Dennis said nothing, but his distaste was obvious as he set to the manual work. Lorelei's mind raced, her eyes shut in concentration as she tried to keep down all the properties of the strange woods they had encountered so far, what might be used as tethers, and further what could be turned into a rod. Her raft was not impressive, nor particularly seaworthy. Lorelei had ended up doing most of the assembly herself, Dennis standing to the side and watching as she painfully pushed up against the logs and planks and strung them together with plant fiber that was as surprisingly elastic as it was violently neon green.
That thing is gonna kill us both. I know. It always looked much easier in books. What? No, why did you admit that? Oh man, oh man.
Dennis began to rock back and forth as Lorelei circled the raft, biting her lip. It had taken hours to actually get the thing to the point where it might hold the two of them and stay aloft, and she still wasn't sure she had spaced the floats evenly enough to keep it from keeling over, especially if they moved around, or were thrown around, by the current.
Look, I promise it won't kill us, right? You want to get home. I know you must be pretty scared right now, but if it ends up getting too rough, we can steer it back to shore and wait for a day or two, reinforce it, and try again.
She must have sounded more confident than she felt, because Dennis gave a long, exasperated sigh. And that was all the protest he gave. The two cautiously boarded the raft, Lorelei unsteadily holding a pole that was really just an uncarved chunk of wood that hadn't been fit for the raft, and pushed off. And almost immediately, the water was upon them. Wave after angry wave crashed against the vessel, the desperation of waters that had no desire to see any travelers upon their churning surface. She couldn't hear Dennis coughing over her own hacking cough as water stung her eyes and filled her lungs, and when she could see, it was only in flashes of jagged rocks and orange water, reared to crash down upon them again. Perhaps it was minutes and perhaps it was hours, but when Lorelei could see clearly, they had been kicked much farther downstream by the currents than she had planned. The water was less fierce, but the rain had picked up and grown heavy with the distant promise of thunder watching them from overhead. Dennis was sprawled out over the raft, breathing slowly. She felt mildly guilty, but Lorelei reached out and poked him twice in the gut. The Dark Lord didn't respond, but muttered something under his breath. Lorelei could make out the words sister and whipped cream and decided that she really didn't want to listen any further. Instead, she watched the river float by. As much as water could, it seemed furious that their raft had held up, and even more furious that it couldn't flood over them, dragging the young woman and the demon into an early grave. No fish looked back at her, but clumps of green moss floated on the watertop like some sort of insular lilypads. Without hesitation, Lorelei began to gather the moss and just watch the terrain pass by.
It's quite safe, you know,
Mildred said from where she was sitting, undrenched and uninterested, on the raft. The witch was grinning craftily, the wide brim of her hat shadowing her face as she spoke.
I imagined as much. Besides, you were gone, so I figured the worst that could happen is that I'd end up boiling some of it and it'd either taste bland and disgusting, or poison me to death. I'd prefer the former, but took the latter into account, just in case.
Mildred clicked her tongue noncommittally, 2 cups of warm tea, red as the mud against the banks of the river, appearing in the air near them. Lorelei took hers. Mildred simply looked at her own, and it tipped itself accordingly.
It isn't common for things to be poisonous by nature, their children must be spread, after all. Only a cruel plant would grow to so wound those around it. And do you truly think I would offer an apprenticeship to abandon you so quickly, kindling? I had to consider it.
Lorelei drank her tea in silence, trying hard to hide her expression. Mildred was staring at the water thoughtfully. Around them, the rock-like teeth of the maw had begun to change shape or form. No longer were they merely rocks, but jagged teeth carved from welded-together metal. Lorelei thought they looked slightly similar to some of the hastily made prefab complexes she had seen, but more designed to cause fear and panic. In their own way, they ended up looking less threatening than the hell of stones they had previously navigated, and she found herself feeling content, perhaps even a little victorious.
It was not always so, that the maw was littered with deterrents such as this.
Mildred had finished her tea, hands cupped into the water as they drifted lazily downstream. The orange red of the current passed over her fingers slowly, seeming mollified by her touch.
Once, the river was a hub for commerce, for those who dared trade amongst it, and for those who draw their lives and livelihood from the basin itself. But both are now impossible, and the jilted river itself remembers nothing but the abandonment that grows within it. Is the river alive, then? Not alive, perhaps, but lashing out in dreams and fitful sleep, watched over by things older and crueler than you and I.
They fell back into silence, Mildred now reading a book quietly. Without shifting her gaze to Lorelei, the witch offered her one as well, and Lorelei took it, even though she understood none of the text scrawled haphazardly over the cover, and the inside was completely blank. Resisting the urge to write amongst the strange, brown pages, Lorelei asked another question that had been burning on her mind.
Will he be all right? Pa. That one is never all right. One such as he is lucky to not have been sent floating down the river, as amusing as such a sight might be.
Lorelei laughed, though only slightly. Dennis himself was getting to, and though he constantly berated others, Lorelei had learned by now that the Dark Lord was constantly in danger of having his feelings hurt.
I didn't do it.
Sputtering out of whatever sentence he had started, Dennis glared at Mildred.
What the heck, just leaving us alone in the darkness and the badness and the rain. Are you some kind of traitor? I'd call you one, if it were my call. And it is my call, 'cause I'm the best.
Mildred shrugged enigmatically, a crooked smile on her withered lips.
Perhaps I am.
Shuddering in cowed fear, Dennis turned to Lorelei, lips pursed in a frown that wanted to start berating her, but the stoic expression she wore seemed to do the trick, and the Dark Lord once again grew demure.
Aren't we going to find a way home? I mean, you two nerds can go study at your library or whatever, but I want to go to a place that has civilization. Shops, dedicated electricity, plenty of duct tape to roll up and over the windows.
The water was no longer pierced just by homemade spears of welded iron, but strange towers of what appeared to be compacted garbage. They rose around them like pillars to the sky, many seasons of equally hard rain having washed any trace of color that had once existed from them, and eroding the edges into blanched sculptures of discarded commodity.
That is not frightening at all. Nope.
Despite that, the Dark Lord adjusted his sunglasses and rubbed his eyes underneath them. Strange shapes hovered around the pillars, most ovoid and glass-like. They hovered near the raft cautiously, rotating in place, before moving towards their pillar of origin, and humming mechanically. The noise wasn't noticeable at first, but as more and more of the strange pillars grew close, the humming became almost deafening, even drowning out the rain which had been pouring down for so long. Mildred tapped Lorelei on the shoulder, surprisingly gently, and Lorelei marveled at the fact the old witch barely had to raise her voice to make herself heard.
Try to steer to the shore, here. Neither of you are ready for what lies beyond, and I have no interest in such a meeting. It would be better to rest for a moment, and then continue on.
Sure. Lorelei acquiesced, trying to fight a gnawing feeling in her stomach that told her she did not want to ask about what waited at the end of the pillars. It took a little effort, but Dennis proved surprisingly motivated after Mildred's cryptic pronouncement, and they managed to dock the raft against an equally blanched and eroded shore, whitened sands greeting them as they lighted upon it. Around the three stretched a desert that clearly had only become as such recently, traces of grassland still visible in the withered and underfed plants that eked out survival amongst the encroaching barrens. Ruins of whitened buildings disintegrated around them, their structural bones dying a slow and ignoble death.
Was this place inhabited, once?
Lorelei asked, running a hand over a countertop that crackled into powdery dust as she rolled past. Mildred clucked her teeth in response, but did not laugh.
Perhaps. It is hard to say with such a place, and harder still to say on an island such as this. Best not to think too much on it, kindling, and to keep going. Hell no. Not thinking is usually my game, but don't you think it's exactly the sort of thing we should be thinking about? I mean, what if there are survival zombies holed up in these ruins, ready to kill and eat you too, and worship me as the god I am?
Dennis said, his voice cracking just enough to betray the faltering of his confidence.
I don't think anything or anyone has survived here, Dennis.
Lorelei responded quietly, recognizing desolation when she saw it. A horrific sizzling of the air as it was electrified and torn apart caused the Dark Lord to scream in terror, and Lorelei to gasp and wheel in place, though Mildred simply seemed nonplussed. Two figures dressed in nice suits and less pleasant ties clawed through the gap in the air that hurt to look at and nodded politely. The first was small and thin, with 5 eyes that glistened against the rain. The second was taller and a bit more full-figured, with several pairs of wings and a tail that irritably swung from side to side, pushing dust and sand up into the fog-kissed air as it did. Waving gingerly at Dennis, the smaller figure smiled and frowned at the same time. An impressive feat, Lorelei felt.
Yo there. Sorry to interrupt you, Miss and Miss, but we've been looking for the Dark Lord for some time. Have you now?
Lorelei muttered, but did nothing to interrupt.
Dark Lord Dennis.
The figure admonished angrily, shaking a lone hand.
Tax revenue has gone down, tax burden has gone up, pensioners are telling us that you stole their pensions to pay for your new entertainment system, the one you trashed in a rage, I must remind you. And your live feeds of your travels with these miscreants have really embarrassed us. Totally embarrassed.
The taciturn demon to his side added helpfully. Pfft. Dennis responded, his faint disinterest indicating that he was going to lay down one well-placed burn as a comeback. But before he could, Lorelei glared at him with a rage so fierce that both the demon attendants recoiled as well, even though neither was the target of it. Her fingers clenched into fists, Lorelei gestured furiously at the confused Dark Lord.
You. You've had the ability to contact other worlds this entire time and you haven't mentioned it. Well, you never asked, and actually it's just my crib back home and... I do not even care. Hey there. We can totally just take off this troublesome Dark Lord from your hands, you know, aha, he's actually in a load of she. No.
Both the Dark Lord and the demon attendants stared in stunned silence as Lorelei shook, visibly.
Not happening. The Dark Lord here is staying with me, and you two can go back and just micromanage or whatever until he's made amends. Actually, have you considered not having a guy like this be, Dark Lord? It'd probably be pretty helpful.
Her anger trailing off, Lorelei realized that the attendants had dropped all pretense of being polite, the spikes rising from their flesh glowing a pale and mottled blue that sizzled as the rain fell on them.
That's kidnapping. 200 years of torture, followed by public execution,
said the shorter demon, only somewhat apologetically.
Sounds right,
tersely responded the other, before lunging straight at Lorelei. Lorelei threw her hands up, but there was no reason. Before the taller demon had a chance to touch her, it wobbled precariously and its head exploded in a shower of what looked like green confetti. The demon stumbled back, then disappeared with the same sizzling sound that had accompanied their arrival earlier. The shorter demon weighed its options carefully, shrugged, and smiled sheepishly at Dennis, who was now quaking and pleading under his breath.
Well, after Gormurg regenerates, we'll probably set up a temporary committee to relieve the dimension until your return. Have fun on your camping trip or whatever.
And with a tiny wave and another sizzle of ultra-heated air, the demon disappeared. Lorelei stared at Mildred, who was simply grinning smugly.
Damnable fools are they who ignore the elderly. Still, you should know that one such as that should recover in time, regrettably. Though I am somewhat confused as to why you decided to not simply dispose of this one, in one manner or another.
Mildred cackled as she stared at Dennis without moving an eye.
It's complicated, I guess. For one, I could really use your ability to communicate with your realm, Dennis, and I'd sure appreciate if there were any other things you had that you would tell us about in the future.
Her tone was calmer than before, but Lorelei could see that even Dennis understood how surprised, shocked, and perhaps even hurt she had felt.
And for another, I know your realm is probably really important to you. Hey. Somewhat important to you, but, and I know this is selfish, it's just been you and me and Mildred so far, and I don't want to end up alone again just yet. Please stay with us for just a while longer. Please.
Dennis sighed in a manner that indicated he was suffering through something akin to torture, and Lorelei smiled.
Thank you. You shouldn't thank the wind for blowing, or the sun for rising.
Mildred spat, though with a barely concealed amusement.
Whatever, it's just that this is more interesting than getting interrupted by my peons. So what does this library of yours look like anyway, M?
Mildred asked with a raised eyebrow.
Mildred, get with the times. It's more efficient to say your name with the least amount of effort possible, because abbreviations are sweet and the less I say it, the less likely you are to appear. Ignoring that, the library should not be particularly different from the buildings we have seen, save that it was woven of a metal more resistant to the decay you have seen so far.
Dennis sniffed.
Like that one in the distance.
pointing a large finger towards a small complex of buildings huddled around a larger one, more colorful and less worn from time. The Dark Lord spat.
Because I am not going in a building with that many runes carved into the side.
And the building was covered with symbols. Sigils that hurt the eye to look at, sigils that glowed in multiple languages at once, sigils that emitted a calming light even as they sapped the will to listen, or think, or breath.
An unusually intelligent idea, demon. The building was not meant for all but a select few. I imagine you might power through such barriers, but it would not be a pleasant or prudent experience. We shall be but a minute. Cool. Hey, I'm kinda hungry.
Dennis began, trailing off purposefully. But Mildred said nothing and simply began hovering towards the library.
Wait. Mildred. Could you make some food? No.
And cackling, Mildred entered the complex, oblivious to the whine of the demon behind her. Lorelei cracked some of the moss she had gathered between her hands, wringing the water from it and handing the remainder to Dennis, who rolled his eyes.
What is this? Food. Ha ha. Yeah, no. Just, could you pretend to try it? I've heard that it won't kill you, and you're obviously hungry. Maybe you'll even find that you like it.
Lorelei remembered the way her mother would always attempt to spin an exotic story about whatever canned food they had been shipped that month, and smiled as widely as she could. But the memory was too recent, and Dennis didn't care, and she left him alone with the moss, feeling drained. The interior of the library complex, like the exterior, still possessed some color. Woven girders of teal-white arched over the entryway, and the roof and ceiling were all but immune to the rain and the elements, soundproofed so heavily that the rain seemed to fade entirely from existence, and Lorelei felt peacefully and wonderfully alone. Ahead of her, Mildred was paging through a thick tome bound from something that was hopefully leather. The witch looked up and acknowledged her presence. For a minute, Lorelei thought she was going to let her simply roam amongst the stacks, but then...
You should not let the past grow so dark in your heart, kindling. It might as well be dead to you now, for as cruel as that may seem. It is better to allow that cruelty, than to let it grow and fester on its own.
Leaning back in her chair and closing her eyes, Lorelei shook the water from her hair and tried to remember something that made her smile.
I can't agree, right now. I need to try to have something. Please.
She replied as a whisper, and Mildred did not criticize her, or reply at all. It took some time for Lorelei to realize the witch had walked next to her, expression mysterious as ever. Then, Mildred smiled. It was not a kindly smile perhaps, but a sympathetic one.
Your hair would not look ungainly if you chose to braid it. Perhaps when we have a more permanent shelter, you would approve of such a thing. Thank you, very much. I'd like that.
Feeling the ghost of a smile returning to her, Lorelei tried to make sense of the books around her. Most were vast and bound by hand, clearly written by a variety of different writers, united only by a fanatic devotion to their own work.
All of these are beyond you, for now. Some are written in ciphers, and others would be better should they have been. I simply wanted you to see the fruits of dreamers such as yourself, and how they remain intelligible to all but those long dead. Thanks, I think. It remains to be seen if you should thank me. Regardless. I also took the time to liberate a few books that we shall go through when we return to that foolish demon outside. Tonight the skies will be clear for a few moments, and it will be a good time to practice the first and simplest lessons you will learn.
Lorelei grinned with an unrestrained and childish glee.
Yes. I mean, excellent. So, what exactly? You shall be knitting a hat, of course. For what is a witch without a hat? For one, you shall notice that my hair is quite protected from the rain.
Laughing disjointedly, Mildred half strode, half floated out of the library. Lorelei watched her go, still smiling. It wasn't quite magic, perhaps, but there would be time for that soon enough. And as the three built a shoddy camp in the shade of the skeletons of buildings long since past, the rain began to die down, the first of many signs that the season of storms had hit its zenith. Fog hung overhead, casting pale light from the reflection of raindrops frozen in time, their eerie light hinting of the ascendancy of the Scandent season yet to come. Chapter End.